my government will immediately remove the consumer carbon tax. But we won't stop there.
That is Nepean. That is the spirit of Nepean behind me right there. Thank you.
As I've been warning for months, America wants our land, our resources, our water, our country. Never. But these are not idle threats. President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us. That will never ever happen. We are once again at one of those hinge moments of history. Our old relationship with the United States, a relationship based on steadily increasing integration, is over. The system of open global trade, anchored by the United States, a system that Canada has relied on since the Second World War, a system that, while not perfect, has helped deliver prosperity for a country for decades, is over. These are tragedies, but it's also our new reality. There's someone who's trying to weaken our economy. Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as we know, has put, as the Prime Minister just said, unjustified tariffs on what we build, on what we sell, on how we make a living. He's attacking Canadian families, workers, and businesses, and we cannot let him succeed. And we won't.
A sign of the times, perhaps, with Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, breaking with tradition and travelling to Europe, not the United States, on his first official foreign trip. Carney was greeted warmly by the French President Emmanuel Macron, and then in London, Carney met with his British counterpart, Sir Keir Starmer. The emphasis on Canada and Europe standing together side by side. And Carney did not hold back in his criticism of the US President.
Nobody's come out forcefully and said those comments about the 51st state are just not on. Do you think that our traditional allies are not sticking their necks out because they're concerned that if they say something that'll anger President Trump, that they'll be next?
I think I would take seriously what the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom said today. I don't think one needs to respond to every comment about another country. Look, we can stand up for ourselves. It's Canada strong. We can stand up for ourselves.
What are they making up there of the overtures and sort of trolling to Canada about being a part of the United States?
Well, I mean, the bottom line is not going to happen. Due respect.
That
the overture. I mean,
because you don't want
well,
to be with.
We're proud. We find you very attractive, but we're not moving in with you. It's not you. It's us. We do things a little differently in Canada. We believe in.
I just want to,
providing.
before you go any further,
Yeah.
I'm up for it. We're up for it. Whatever you do differently, we want to experiment too. What do you guys want?
We can be.
You want like
We can be friends. There can be a few benefits, John. Friends with benefits, but not. We're not going to commit all the way. Benefits of trade, benefits of defense.
right.
Yeah.
No, we'll be cool about it. We won't levy tariffs on all your goods as retribution for you not going out with us. We respect your boundaries. Is there a fear now that there will be an economic trade war with Canada?
Let's kick things off with the big meeting at the White House. Donald Trump has been obsessed with making Canada the 51st state ever since he found out Epstein Island was not eligible. Well, today, Canada's new Prime Minister came to the White House, which gave Donald Trump an opportunity to make his proposal in person. Come on, Donald, use that Trump charm to put a ring on it.
It would really be a wonderful marriage because it's two places that get along very well. They like each other a lot.
Aww. It's like watching an episode of Love on the Spectrum. If the spectrum was fascism. Prime Minister Carney, what do you say?
Well, if I may, as you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale. And having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign last several months, it's not for sale, won't be for sale ever.
I think Donald Trump just got friend-zoned.
I'm announcing today that the Canadian government will now match the United States by removing all of Canada's tariffs on U.S. goods specifically covered under CUSMA. This decision will take effect, September 1st of this year. So in short, the situation we're in now is that Canada and the United States have reestablished free trade for the vast majority of our goods. Canada will retain our tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos, as we work intensively with the United States to resolve the issues there.
Carney of Canada yesterday morning.
Yes.
Actually, Canada is taking away some retaliatory tariffs.
He's removing his tariffs, yeah.
Exactly.
He's removing his retaliatory tariffs, which I thought was nice. And we're going to have another call soon.
He ran on competence, calm, and big pivots. Carbon pricing axed for consumers, a détente with Washington, a promise to steady the economy without shocks. So, how bad is Mark Carney actually? Let's audit the record from day one to now. He took office in March 2025. That date matters because context frames expectations. A former central banker sitting in the prime minister's chair was never going to be judged by the same yardstick as a career politician. People read his resume like a promise of flawless management. But how does a central banker even end up prime minister in the first place? The real story here is what came next, the expectations game. From the moment Carney entered office, public attitudes were already warped by his unusual background. He had never campaigned, never done retail politics, and never ground out a career in parliament. Instead, his resume was the stuff of headlines. Economics at Harvard in 1988, a master's and PhD at Oxford in 1993 and 1995, Governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, Governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020, and then UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance starting in 2020. With credentials like that, voters weren't just expecting competence, they were expecting him to live up to the image of the man who had already navigated global crises. The contrast with political life couldn't be more stark. At a central bank, decisions are measured, filtered through reams of data, and justified months or even years down the line. In politics, the timelines collapse. You're expected to lead coalitions, respond to opponents, survive the day-to-day churn, and adjust instantly when circumstances shift. To put it simply, it's like being a trained pilot and suddenly being asked to run the entire airline. Related, but not the same job. That gap fueled two sharply different expectations. Supporters saw him as the adult in the room, a leader who could stabilize inflation, restore credibility abroad, and project calm authority at home. Critics, though, read the same record as a symbol of distance. Harvard, Oxford, Goldman Sachs, two of the world's leading central banks, the UN. To them, it felt less like representation of voters and more like a checklist of global elite circles. That's why the early nickname Banker Prime Minister stuck so easily. Both visions, savior versus technocrat, were projections. Neither was rooted in what the job of Prime Minister actually demands, and the stakes were brutally high from the outset. He didn't inherit the kind of partisan machinery or seasoned political capital that most prime ministers can lean on. Instead, he walked in while inflation was still squeezing households, housing costs were eating half of many paychecks, and climate policy was screaming for clear direction. Under that kind of pressure, every decision carried double weight. Technical moves, something as dry as tinkering with a levee, were recast as tests of judgment, leadership, and identity. That's where the impossible expectations started to bite. It wasn't only that Carney had to govern, it was that every choice was measured against the mythology of his resume. A man who once guided central banks was suddenly expected to engineer daily political miracles. And the style he had honed, cautious, disciplined, deliberately incremental, was almost guaranteed to collide with the noisy urgency of parliamentary politics. Failures to transform the political landscape overnight weren't seen as the normal grind of government. They were depicted as betrayal. And right out of the gate, that perception shaped the reaction to his first moves in office. Canadians weren't just watching for signals of leadership. They were waiting to see if the celebrated climate envoy would govern one way overseas and then act another way at home, which is exactly why his opening policy choice landed with such force. It wasn't a routine adjustment. It was a decision that redefined him in the eyes of both his supporters and his critics. One of Carney's earliest moves was what quickly became known as the carbon pivot. Regulations brought in March 2025 stopped the federal fuel charge from applying as of April 1st, 2025, and his government followed by tabling legislation to phase out the framework entirely. Consumers noticed immediately. National average pump prices fell from about 155 cents per liter to roughly 143.6 cents per liter, a drop of around 11 cents. Some provinces saw declines above 10 cents, with New Brunswick recording the sharpest fall, while in places like Quebec, where a provincial cap-and-trade system already dominated, the effect was muted. Analysts like Rystad Energy and the Canadian Fuels Association had pegged the carbon component of gasoline between 17.6 and 20 cents per liter, which helps explain why the actual declines varied depending on regional supply chains and tax regimes. To most drivers, though, relief showed up the next time they filled their tank. But the legal picture looked different. The repeal was staged across years, not days. Phase 1 eliminated charging provisions on April 1st, 2025, which caused the visible price drop. Phase 2 ends consumer rebates in October 2025. Phase 3 tackles registration requirements in November 2025. And Phase 4 clears out the remaining provisions, but not until April 2035. In other words, consumers witnessed an immediate impact, while the bureaucracy will be unwinding the framework for a decade. The contradiction was glaring because of who Carney was before politics. This was the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, a man who lectured global banks about stranded assets and argued for predictable carbon signals to steer capital. He spent years framing carbon pricing as the most efficient and transparent tool to cut emissions. Then, one of his first actions as Prime Minister tore out the most visible form of that policy at home. For environmentalists and financial observers alike, it raised a basic question. How could the champion of price signals discard the very mechanism he once promoted? Supporters had an answer. They framed it as political triage. Scrap the levy hitting households and put the fight where emissions are hardest to control: industrial operations, freight transportation, and power grids. Families got instant relief at the pump, and the government reclaimed room to design targeted industrial standards, clean tech credits, and mandate-driven incentives. Critics saw something simpler and harsher: a revenue hole and a credibility hit. The federal rebates tied to the carbon charge will vanish this fall, and provinces and businesses that planned around the original framework now face moving targets. They called this policy whiplash, the very back and forth that erodes trust in Canada's climate plan and rattles investment decisions. And without a consumer price signal, skeptics warned, Canada was discarding one of the clearest ways to measure actual emission reductions. The hard truth is that repealing a fuel charge creates an instant headline. Building a replacement system takes years. Industrial standards, technology mandates, subsidies, none deliver overnight. That lag risks leaving a vacuum, even if the government insists its replacements will eventually deliver. Carney's gamble is that follow-through will come quick enough to satisfy voters, environmental groups, and markets before the contradiction hardens into a political liability. This instinct, to smooth costs for consumers in the near term and bet on longer-term systems, wasn't limited to the carbon file. Within months, he applied a similar approach beyond climate to another politically charged area: cross-border trade. On August 22, 2025, Carney announced Canada would remove many of its retaliatory tariffs on American goods while retaining duties on auto parts, steel, and aluminum. The rollout stunned both supporters and critics because during the campaign he had vowed to stand firm against Washington on trade. These weren't token tariffs being scrapped either. They covered items families actually buy, like condiments, appliances, even bicycles. With that wave of tariffs gone and the key industrial sectors shielded, the policy sent a carefully layered message. Protect the backbone industries tied to jobs and pride, but cut costs on household goods. Carney tied the decision directly to the USMCA framework. He argued that Canada would match the U.S. by lifting Canadian tariffs on goods specifically covered under the trade deal. Ottawa described this as restoring a rules-first relationship, while Washington cast it as de-escalation. Markets noticed. The Canadian dollar ticked up after the announcement. For households, the more immediate consequence was relief at the checkout aisle, since removing those tariffs put downward pressure on the price of common imports at a time inflation was still squeezing budgets. Critics hit fast. Opposition MPs argued that Carney had campaigned as a trade hardliner, yet folded on his first big test. Union leaders, including the president of Unifor, told reporters this looked like Canada backing down at the cost of industrial jobs. Small manufacturers raised alarms that losing tariff protection could hasten closures in already strained sectors. Supporters countered with a different frame. They said that preserving tariffs on autos, aluminum, and steel showed he wasn't blinking at all on the industries that matter most for Canada's prosperity. Rolling back duties on ketchup or bicycles wasn't surrender, it was smart triage. By clearing out minor disputes, Canada avoided draining energy before the high-stakes 2026 negotiations. In step with the announcement, Carney also held a call with President Trump. Ottawa described it as productive, and Trump made a point of offering public praise afterwards. That moment carried symbolic weight. For some, it hinted that Carney was smooth enough to win a rare nod from an unpredictable White House. For others, it was confirmation of their fears, that he was being played as too pliant, too willing to bend. The immediate payoffs of the tariff rollback were undeniable. Markets steadied, the loonie strengthened, shelves stocked with cheaper imports. But the political costs were harder to measure and potentially more lasting. In finance, placating volatility earns applause. In politics, appearances dominate alongside outcome. A leader who looks conciliatory, even if the policy logic holds, risks being framed as passive or easily pushed around. That tension left Carney in familiar territory, praised for technical precision, attacked for political optics. It was an early case study in what would become a defining theme of his tenure, the contrast between how he governs and how politics demands leaders be seen. Dashboards and forecasts don't win votes in the House, but Carney often governs as if he's still briefing a bank board. His style is sequential and measured. He picks a single stress point, addresses it, then moves on. First came the consumer fuel charge rollback. Months later, the tariff changes. Each choice was layered, controlled, designed to avoid market surprises. That pacing fits the rhythm of finance, where predictability earns credibility. In politics, though, momentum matters just as much as sequence, and delays can look like hesitation rather than prudence. Because what seems prudent inside a central bank translates differently in Parliament. A considered rate cut can be praised as deliberate in finance, but when reframed across the aisle, it reads as slow, uncertain, or even weak. The carbon decision made that clear. Some applauded the tangible relief at the pump. Opponents quickly branded it as abandoning climate credibility. With tariffs, markets rewarded the stability, and the dollar strengthened, yet critics cast it as retreat in the face of U.S. pressure. His moves calmed markets and steadied the currency, but public perception, especially among opposition MPs and some regional voters, tilted toward detachment. Supporters point to the same calm style and see reassurance. When others spar, he avoids theatrics. When interviewed, he prefers statistics over slogans. To them, that signals control and discipline. Critics see the opposite, a leader distant from the public mood, leaning on numbers without emotion. They argue his calculated tone reflects the banker's detachment, delivering instructions rather than connection. Time horizons deepen the challenge. In monetary policy, decisions take quarters or even years to show full effect. But households balancing bills want immediate relief. A gas price drop delivered an instant boost, but housing affordability, wages, and grocery bills shift much more slowly. Regional divides make timing even harder to manage. In Western Canada, scrapping the federal fuel charge was seen as incomplete, a first step without the speed they wanted. In Ontario suburbs, families wondered why action seemed limited to carbon relief, while food and housing costs still mount. Each region measures urgency differently. Speeding up for one group risks alienating another. Going slow to balance both feeds a story of paralysis. Here's the metaphor that captures it. Running a government like monitoring vital signs. Indicators may show blood pressure dropping or stability returning, but if the patient doesn't feel better, confidence vanishes. Carney can point to metrics showing volatility down and currency steadier, but unless voters feel relief at the end of the month, the reassurance is hollow. This is the personal test for Carney. The technocrat must now learn storytelling and coalition building, skills not measured on a balance sheet but crucial for moving people. His record shows organization and control. Politics, however, measures warmth, urgency, and the ability to build broad alliances. That's the muscle he hasn't had to flex until now. 6 months into Carney's tenure, the record can be measured decision by decision, not by sweeping verdicts. His government has acted on energy costs, trade friction, and climate policy, but the outcomes look less like clean wins and more like a set of half-finished assignments. On the economy, the clearest impact showed up at the pump. When Ottawa ceased applying the consumer carbon fuel charge on April 1, 2025, the price effect was direct and visible. Reuters reported the national average dropped from near 155 cents per liter to about 143.6 cents. Several provinces saw deeper cuts, over 10 cents in Ontario and British Columbia, and 15 cents in New Brunswick, the largest decline recorded. That provided instant relief for families and grabbed headlines. But inflation doesn't hinge on one levy. Housing, wages, grocery supply, global oil markets, and interest rates all drive household budgets. On that score, Carney can only claim a short-term boost, while the structural problems remain largely unchanged. On trade, the August 22nd rollback of many retaliatory tariffs smoothed relations with Washington and gave markets a clear signal of discipline before the 2026 USMCA review. Removing those duties lifted the Canadian dollar and cut uncertainty for importers. Still, tariffs on autos, steel, and aluminum stayed in place, ensuring that Canada entered the next round of talks with bargaining chips, but also with exposure. The market effect was positive in the short run, yet producers in core sectors remain vulnerable until the upcoming review settles the rules. Governance highlights the gap between markets and voters. His standing as a former central banker reassures foreign allies and investors who see steadiness. At home, the picture is different. Voters feel only part of the relief. Gasoline prices dropped, but rents and food bills remain painful. His cautious sequencing risks, sounding detached when set against everyday urgency. Climate policy shows the same split. The Department of Finance set out a phased repeal. Charging provisions ended in April 2025, rebates expire this October, registration falls in November, and the final cleanup isn't scheduled until 2035. The tax is gone for consumers, but the replacement framework is still undefined. If industrial standards or clean tech credits don't take shape soon, that gap hardens into a liability. So the scorecard so far is not failure, but unfinished work. Visible relief in the short term, uncertainty in the long term. The choices taken were the straightforward ones. The tougher test comes when the government has to build new frameworks rather than dismantle existing ones. What lies ahead isn't about cleaning up old frameworks. It's about proving whether Carney can build durable ones under pressure. This is the next phase, and it sharpens into 3 defining tests: the climate replacement, the 2026 USMCA review, and the housing productivity squeeze. On climate, the consumer carbon price is already being unwound in stages. Charging provisions ended April 1st, 2025, rebates vanish October 1st, and registration rules disappear November 1st. By April 1st, 2035, the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act will be fully repealed. The repeal appears orderly on paper, but the credibility gap shows up fast. Replacement policies, industrial carbon standards, clean tech credits, sector-specific rules must be rolled out quickly. For years, Carney argued that predictable signals anchor markets. If nothing fills the vacuum soon, activists will frame it as betrayal, and global partners will discount Canada's climate commitments the next time emissions data is reported. On trade, the weight is heavier still. The USMCA review happens in July 2026, with preparatory talks likely starting next spring. But in late July 2025, Washington escalated, slapping 35% tariffs on Canadian goods outside USMCA, citing fentanyl smuggling and barriers. That exposed how fragile the truce is. Ottawa has to secure meaningful gains in autos, agriculture, and critical minerals, or else risk the perception that concessions were one-sided. Without tangible wins to show Canadian workers and businesses before talks begin, the argument that he kept relations steady will weaken. Then comes housing and productivity, the pressure point he cannot avoid. Inflation relief at the pump won't count for much if families remain locked out of homes, or if business investment doesn't turn into visible construction and jobs. Fixing supply chains, speeding permits, and mobilizing labor are the messy, long-haul moves voters expect to see start soon. The urgency is brutal. Activists want a climate framework yesterday. Businesses need trade clarity in months. Voters want housing relief today. If Carney can show concrete industrial policies and secure trade wins before the USMCA review, his method will look disciplined and deliberate. If not, early relief risks being dismissed as temporary appeasement. And that's where the record pivots. Up to now, we've seen restraint and sequencing. What comes next shows whether that style works when politics refuses to move on banker time. So far, Carney's record is neither a triumph nor a collapse. He has removed visible pressures, fuel charges at the pump, tariffs on consumer goods, and steadied markets. What he hasn't produced yet are durable replacements that prove his policies can last beyond the first headlines. That gap between short-term relief and long-term structure is where his leadership will ultimately be judged. So here's the debate. Which matters more to you? Steady, cautious management or fast, risky fixes? Say steady or bold in the comments and explain why. And if you want more audits like this, like and subscribe.